Talk this evening. So please welcome to the Chautauqua stage this Honorable Stephen A. Douglas, Senator from Illinois, and Mr. Abraham Lincoln.
Good luck, Judge.
My fellow citizens, residents and citizens of the territory of Kansas, it is with great pleasure that I come here tonight. I am Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which established Kansas Territory. I am here tonight to speak to you of the great vision of the one true national party that we have in this country. I refer, of course, to the democracy founded by Andrew Jackson and perpetuated because it represents the will of the common people. That is the mechanics, the farmers, the entrepreneurs, upon whom this great nation is expanding and from whom this great nation draws its moral purpose and its strength, the purpose of universal manhood suffrage, by which we have the majority ruling, one of the great principles of the democracy. And the democracy believes that we must trust the wisdom of the people, and therefore the great decisions should be made in the sovereignty of the states and of the local governments. That we must not allow the national government to interfere with the economics, with the social systems, which is best defined, they are best defined, by the people of the states and the territories. And these three great principles, universal manhood suffrage based on majority rule, states' rights and the sovereignty of states and local governments, and laissez-faire, non-interference by the national government in the rule and the wisdom of people in their states and localities, will form a great democracy which I believe is destined to stretch from ocean to ocean. I speak not only for the cause of the democracy, but I call you to the cause of young America, a muscular, powerful, new nation that will create this ocean to ocean democracy. I have a vision of a country whose great strength and great energy lies west of the Mississippi River, peopled by free labor, by common men and women and their families, a vision of a nation of mechanics and farmers and small businessmen, entrepreneurs, free to govern themselves under the power of the democratic majority rule. Now, I came to Illinois at the age of about 20, and already had had some experience in Western New York and in Vermont with Jacksonian democracy, and was privileged to be one of the leaders in forming the democracy in the state of Illinois. In 1843, I was elected at the age of 30 to the United States Congress. I served 2 terms. I was elected to 3. But instead of serving that 3rd term, I took my seat in the United States Senate in 1847. In both the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate, it has been my privilege to chair the Committee on Territories. And I have a vision of carving out west of the Mississippi large new territories, which we will quickly bring into this country as states, and thereby perpetuate the democracy from ocean to ocean. I also think it would be a good idea for us to consider the purchase of Cuba and the purchase of Santo Domingo. And I believe that we should cooperate with that great American citizen, William Walker, who has recently established a government in Nicaragua and seeks annexation by the United States. It is our destiny to bring the civilization of the democracy from ocean to ocean, and if God wills, from pole to pole. A nation of farmers, a nation of mechanics and craftsmen, a nation of entrepreneurs and merchants, by which we will see a prosperity and a power of government by common people never before known in world history. It was because of this concept that I became convinced that we needed to do something to solve the slavery question once and for all. My friends, I am convinced that slavery is not the future of this country, that slavery is not suitable to the vast lands west of the Mississippi. I perceive instead a democracy of villages and cities, of a thriving government of the common man. But when the Nebraska bill was proposed in 1852, it received great opposition from the South simply because they wished to have no new territories carved out of land prohibited to slavery. They were concerned about maintaining an equal number of free states and slave states. Well, I do not believe there is a great future for slavery. I believe, in fact, that in the states of the Upper South, slavery will dwindle away and perhaps disappear. But whatever happens to slavery, it should be the choice of the people at the local and state level. It should not be imposed on them from outside the local and state level, and it should not be imposed on them by the national government. In 1848, the candidate of the Democracy for the presidency, Lewis Cass, first discussed the concept of popular sovereignty. The idea that the people of a territory, by their vote, by the writing of their territorial constitution, could determine the structure of their new state, including their decision on whether to be a free state and a slave state. It should be left as a matter of territorial determination for the future states. In 1850, California proposed to be admitted to the United States as a free state. It would have been the 31st state. It would have given us 16 free states and 15 slave states. This caused great concern. Now, you may not be aware of the fact, but since 1843, I have been responsible for the writing of every organizing act for every territory that has come into the Union since 1843. I wrote the organizing act that created Florida as a state. I was the one who steered the Texas annexation bill through the House of Representatives, including the clause that Texas could divide itself into 4 additional states at a later date. Even at that time, I expected that at least 3 of those 4 additional states would probably be free states. So in 1853, I suggested that instead of a Nebraska bill, we have a Kansas-Nebraska bill, creating two large territories, and by doing that, finish the dividing up of the former Louisiana Purchase into states. Along the way, as part of the 1850 Compromise, I authored the bills that organized New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, both of which were organized with popular sovereignty. And again, we later would add Nevada Territory to Utah, Arizona Territory to the New Mexico Territory, and we would carve out Washington Territory once Oregon Territory, which I wrote the Organizing Act for, as I've suggested, became a state. We also had worked out the organizing actions for Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin territories, all of which, by 1858, along with Oregon, had been admitted as states. And in short, we have, at this point, drawn the boundary lines for territories to become states in all of the area, not yet states, west of the Mississippi River. We see a great future before us, a future of popular sovereignty which will create an ocean-to-ocean democracy. These are not spur-of-the-moment organizing acts. They follow 50 years of experience of expansion and the bringing in of new states. In fact, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we have a provision in which each township will set aside revenues of 2 sections to provide for public education. Not one township, as in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. We see a great nation traversed by transcontinental railroads with an educated citizenry of the common people, ruled by majority rule, with the power among the state and local governments, and this vision of the democracy will create a future and a nation unparalleled in world history. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Douglas, it's also a pleasure for me, Abraham Lincoln, to be here tonight and to debate with the judge these critical issues for our nation. The judge has just given you a glorious vision of a great nation expanding from sea to sea and from pole to pole. That vision seems unencumbered by any problems, at least as the judge sees it. And yet, there is a problem, one that has plagued this nation since its beginning, one that the framers of the Constitution, the fathers of this country, felt that they had under control. But the judge, with his vision of a great expanding nation, has unleashed that monster once again. What is it that I speak of? It is the issue of slavery. Back when this nation was being founded, the framers made provisions to place slavery in the course of ultimate extinction so that the public mind could rest assured that the future of America would be the future of a free nation. How can I say that this is so? They made provision to cut off the source of slavery by specifying an end to the African slave trade. And in another matter, in the only territory at that time belonging to the United States, they made provision that slavery would be forever inhibited in that territory. So on the one matter, they cut off the source. On the other, they halted the extension. And why would they do that if they did not believe that slavery would be in the course of ultimate extinction. Look at the Constitution that those fathers gave us. Look in vain for the word slavery. Although there are provisions that deal with slavery, it is never named as such. And why do you suppose that is? Perhaps it is because they understood that as slavery disappeared, there would be no need to change the Constitution. There would be no need to identify this nation as one that had slavery at its core. Indeed, they wished it not to be so. On January 1st, 1854, prior to the creation of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the people of the United States of America could rest assured that slavery had been placed in the course of ultimate extinction. They could rest assured that the number of free states was greater than the number of slave states, and that the population of those free states was growing more rapidly than the population of those slave states. And that in the future, America would become all free because of the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution. But less than 1 month later, Judge Douglas had inserted into the Kansas-Nebraska bill a provision that would allow slave owners to bring their slaves into territory that had previously been forbidden to slavery, and called this by the name of popular sovereignty. Such a misnomer has hardly ever been presented to the American people so boldly. In fact, Salmon Chase in the United States Senate asked for an amendment to the Kansas-Nebraska bill that under popular sovereignty, the people of a territory would be allowed to vote to forbid slavery, and Judge Douglas and his friends voted it down. What was this then, this popular sovereignty? Was this not simply a door opening to allow slavery to come through? Didn't the judge just tell you that he put it into the bill because Southern slave state leaders said they would not support a territory which did not allow slavery to come into it? Is this not then an attempt to make the nation a nation of slaves? Once the Kansas-Nebraska bill became law, there was a tremendous uprising in the nation. Throughout the North, a new political party took shape, the Republican Party, of which I am a member. And the major tenet of that party is our opposition to the extension of slavery. Thank you. We do not oppose slavery where it already exists. Those slave states can rest comfortably in the knowledge that we have no opposition to their continuing slavery. But we will not brook its extension into territories, and especially into territories that were once forbidden to slavery. The judge is fond of asking me, why is it that I will not permit the continuation of a nation that is half slave and half free? But his question to me is based on a falsehood, a false belief that the framers of this nation created a nation half slave and half free. They found a nation in which slavery existed, and they could not, in a short time, find a way to end slavery. But by the provisions they took, they made provision for a future nation where slavery would disappear. And so I turned to the judge and asked him why he wished to change the policy of the framers of this nation, why he wished to take the only policy that had ever brought peace to this nation, that had ever brought a sense of security to this nation, why he had to present a new policy cloaked in the name of popular sovereignty. I turn to the judge and ask him why he could not leave this nation alone, but why he had to introduce, once again, slavery into the extension of this nation. Friends, we are now far into the 6th year since a policy was initiated by the judge with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. But under that policy, the agitation over slavery has not only not ceased, but it has constantly increased year by year. You read the good book. You know the statement. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And I believe that this nation cannot continue to exist permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the nation to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect this nation to become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of slavery and place it once again in its course of ultimate extinction, where the public can rest assured, or its supporters will push it forward until it becomes a nation all slave. And I ask you, have we no tendency to this latter condition? Look back at the recent years of your history and see what has happened in this nation. It almost begins to look like a conspiracy of President Polk drawing in new territories from the war with Mexico. And then my friend here, Judge Douglas, adding the provision that allows slavery to expand into territories where they could not have been previously. And now, even more recently, in 1857, the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Justice Roger Taney, have declared that Americans can take slaves into any territory, and there is no way in which the people of that territory can prevent that. What happens then to this promise of popular sovereignty? What kind of pledge is left in this promise? In fact, let me open the debate with Judge Douglas now by asking him a question. But before I do that, I'm reminded of a story. You see, the judge is in a difficult position now. His whole idea of popular sovereignty seems almost to have been swept away. And I intend to ask him a question which will show to you just how thin it has become. But it reminds me of a situation that happened several years ago in New Orleans, when there was provision for a balloon ascension. And a young man climbed into the gondola under the balloon and asked that it be raised. He was dressed very finely, as you might expect, all bangles and beads, and looking very much like a circus performer. The balloon went up into the air, and then a heavy wind came up. You people in Kansas will understand this story. And blew the balloon miles and miles away. And it was some time before the young man could get control of that balloon again and bring it back down to earth. When it came down, It landed in a field where some Negroes were picking cotton. And they too knew something about the good book, particularly the book of Revelation. And they ran for the woods as fast as they could. All except for one. An elderly darky who had much rheumatism and could hardly walk, let alone run, finding himself caught by this situation. He brushed himself off as best he could and looked at the young man coming from the heavens and now walking toward him and said to him, "Why, good morning, Massa Jesus. How's your pa?" I think Judge Douglas is in a similar kind of predicament. And so, Judge, let me now ask you this question. Can the people, Judge, can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wishes of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Judge.
Another one of your stories
Yes, sir.
that has no point whatsoever. Mr. Lincoln, I would like to emphatically reply to you, as I have replied over 100 times from every stump in Illinois, that the people of a territory can most emphatically exclude slavery before their formation as a state. It matters not how the Supreme Court rules on the abstract question of slavery. The people of a territory can introduce or exclude slavery simply on the grounds that slavery cannot exist for an hour or a day in a territory where the people are unwilling and the local police power will not enforce the law. Let me give you an example, Mr. Lincoln. In Illinois, let's say that we have a merchant of groceries and liquors who decides he wishes to locate in Kansas territory. He has every right to take his property into Kansas territory. But the means by which he will sell his grocery and liquor, the circumstances under which he will sell his groceries and liquor, and the remedies of the law under which he will be allowed to sell his groceries and liquor belong to the people of the territory. And without a constitutional prohibition against liquor, an unfriendly people, an unwilling legislature will be just as effective in ending the sale of liquor in the territory. And this is what I believe will happen with popular sovereignty, and this is what I believe will happen with the territorial legislatures. I would like to point out to you that I believe that popular sovereignty has worked in Kansas. For in Kansas, we had a Lecompton Constitution, which President Buchanan was determined to honor and bring Kansas in as the 16th slave state, the 32nd state. I, on the floor of the Senate, denounced the Lecompton Constitution as fraud. I denounced the border ruffians for their violence, and I denounced President Buchanan for his political skullduggery in bringing in the fraud of the Lecompton Constitution. But a free state legislature has been elected by lawful means. They are sitting and writing a constitution, and it will be their will, I suppose, that Kansas will be a free state. Popular sovereignty has worked. Mr. Lincoln?
The judge says that popular sovereignty has worked. He seems to think that I am pestering him all these years on that issue. And although he seems to think that he has put that issue to rest, it keeps coming up time after time after time. Reminds me of a story. We had a fisherman in New Salem who liked to fish on the Sangamon River and thought he was a pretty good fish, well, thought he was the best fisherman around. Liked to brag about it. Well, you know, after a while, people get tired of hearing fishermen brag all the time about the great fish that they caught, and of course they put it back in the water. So, to allay their suspicions, this man bought scales on which he could weigh the fish. So after that, he kept the fish, he brought them home, he put them on the scales, and he called all the neighbors to come and see this enormous fish that he caught there on the river by New Salem. You know, for a long time then, everyone thought this man was absolutely the best fisherman. And then one day, a baby was born in the cabin next door. And the proud parents came over to borrow his scales to weigh the baby. The baby weighed 47 pounds. Now, perhaps you see why it's difficult for the judge to put down this problem with popular sovereignty. In fact, there's another way that perhaps I could explain this to you. Just before we had our debate start, I was talking with some people in the audience, and there's a bright young man somewhere here named Nathan. Nathan, would you come up here? I see him in the distance here. Now, I'm going to ask Nathan a question. I don't think he'll need any help from you, but if you feel you have to shout something out, that'll be all right. Nathan, welcome. It's good to see you. Nathan, I have a question for you. Do you know what the question is? See, I haven't set this up. All right. Nathan, you saw some dogs around here tonight, didn't you? All right. How many legs does a dog have? 4. All right. Thank you. Now I have another question. If Judge Douglas called the tail of a dog a leg, how many legs would a dog have? 5. All right. Thank you very much, Nathan. I really appreciate it. Now you can see just how powerful Judge Douglas is on the minds of people, going around seeing 4-legged dogs and saying, well, the tail must be a leg, so it's a 5-legged dog. And people say, yes, yes, it must be, that's right. And he says, popular sovereignty, it works. And people say, well, yes, yes, it must work. And I ask you, you are now at the point where you have chosen a constitution, and it is likely, as the judge said, that you may enter the Union as a free state. But look back now on 6 or more years of bloodshed, of constant conflict, and ask yourself, is this way better than the old way that the framers had set of keeping the territories free of slavery? Is the bloodshed, the murder, the deaths a better system than what you had in place before the judge brought in this notion of popular sovereignty? Has the judge not run down this idea of popular sovereignty so thin that it looks to you like that homeopathic soup made by boiling the shadow of a pigeon that starved to death. Let me move on to another point. Judge Douglas likes to assert that the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men are created equal, did not include the Negro. Now, we Republicans believe it did include the Negro. And I defy the judge or anyone here to search through the annals of history down to the present decade and find a single instance of a political leader who denied that the Declaration of Independence included the Negro. You will not find a single instance of this prior to 1857. And it did not occur before then because the idea of popular sovereignty had not demanded it until the judge came to the realization that he was calling for a popular sovereignty which allowed one man to have the right to enslave another. Does that sound to you like popular sovereignty? I think not. On what does the Democrat Party hang its argument that the Negro is not included in the Declaration of Independence? Merely this, on the fact that the framers of the Declaration and of the Constitution did not take steps immediately to place that Negro in a position of equality. But that argument falls immediately when you recognize that the framers did not take steps immediately to place all white people in positions of equality. They declared that all men are created equal, that all have certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in making that declaration, they set the promise in the belief that as soon as possible, the reality would come true. I think then that the authors of the Declaration intended to include all men, but they did not declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to assert that, which would be untrue, but they meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might occur as soon as circumstances might permit. Judge.
The signers of the Declaration of Independence did not intend that all men would be equal, that the Negro would be equal. They were speaking of white men, men of European ancestry and descent. Now I see some people shaking their heads. But I would remind you that Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, owned slaves. Would he have continued to own slaves if he believed he was violating divine authority? I would remind you that every state of the original 13 states allowed slaveholding. Not a single signer freed his slaves. Would they have done this if it was their intent that all men created equal included the Negro? I believe that this government was made by our fathers on a white basis, that it was to be benefiting white men and their posterity and administered by white men for all time to come. Now, because I believe that the Negro ought not to be a citizen, cannot be a citizen, should not be a citizen, it does not follow that he must be a slave. Frankly, I do not care if a territory votes slavery up or down. it is of indifference to me, so long as the majority will is fairly reflected. And I actually suspect that no territory west of the Mississippi will vote to allow slavery. But because the Negro is not a citizen, it does not follow that he should be a slave. Humanity requires and Christianity commands that we have an obligation to all inferior and dependent beings to give them every privilege, immunity, and advantage that is consistent with the public safety. Now, I am somewhat afraid and somewhat concerned that Mr. Lincoln's love of the Negro is reflected even to the point that he would like a Negro woman for a wife, that he has a concept of equality, that rather than have them as slaves, he would marry them. At one of my recent speeches, a carriage, so I'm telling a story. At one of my recent speeches, a carriage stood at the outside of the audience. In the box at the upper part of the carriage sat a beautiful young white woman, while in the seat of the carriage, in the interior, sat her mother and that black Republican abolitionist, Fred Douglass, while the owner of the carriage sat up in the driver's seat and acted as the driver. Now, I suppose those of you who believe in the equality of the Negro, who are willing to believe that the Negro is your equal socially, politically, and legally, however foolish that may be on your part, will probably just as foolishly vote for Mr. Lincoln.
The judge tells us that Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence, owned slaves. And I must remind all of us that Thomas Jefferson also said, "I tremble for my countrymen when I think that God is just." Now, Judge Douglas knows, as I know, as everyone here knows, that there is a natural disgust in the minds of almost all white people to the idea of an indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and black races. And clearly, Judge Douglas hopes to attach the benefit of that disgust to himself and against the Republican Party by claiming that Republicans, because they believe that the Declaration includes Negroes, must want to vote and eat and sleep and marry with Negroes. Now, I have never proposed that Negroes have the right to vote, nor that they should sit on juries. But I must protest against that false logic that declares that because I don't want a Negro woman for a slave, I must want her as a wife. I need not do either. I can simply leave her alone. In some respects, she is not my equal. She is not my equal in color, and probably not my equal in moral and intellectual abilities. But she is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every person here in her right to eat the bread that she earns with her own hands without the leave of anybody else. In that she is our equal. I see it is time for us to move to concluding remarks. Judge?
What, no stories? This country has had two great political parties that have operated by great universal principles. Now only the Democratic Party is left to speak for the nation. The Whig Party has been replaced by the Black Republicans, abolitionists who sow the seeds of disunity. This is not a debate over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is not a debate over slavery. It is a debate over the future of this country and the preservation of the Union, which only can be served by an ocean-to-ocean democracy. I care more for the great principle of self-government, for the right of the people to rule themselves, than I care for all the Negroes in Christendom. The territories may vote slavery up, they may vote it down. It matters not to me. I am indifferent. I would not endanger the perpetuity of the Union. I would not blot out the great inalienable rights of white men for all the Negroes that ever existed. The Negroes need not be slaves. They can have rights. But I say, let us preserve the Union. And let us do this by following the will of the people. They have the right to keep slavery or to abolish it as they please. But in doing this, let us remember that our great mission is the elevation of democracy for our citizens from sea to sea, from pole to pole, that our great future is in the West in bringing these territories into statehood and ending forever the division in our country. Thank you. Good evening.
The great vision that Judge Douglas speaks of is a vision which so blinds him to another exceedingly important point, which is that the only time in which the preservation of this Union has ever been endangered, it has been over the issue of slavery. Go back and look at your annals of history. Look back at the Constitutional Convention. Look at the Compromise of 1820. Look at the nullification crisis in 1830. And look at the Wilmot Proviso during the Mexican War. In each of these instances, the great threat to the nation was the extension of slavery. And now the judge says, I don't care. His vision is so marred by his inability to see the danger that stands before us that we must seek a different vision. In fact, the judge's position reminds me of another story. His tendency to speak these wonderful words, these glorious words that may sway more people in the audience, until they stop and ask the question, what is the purpose of these words? Is it to pledge us to a continually expanding nation, or is it to open up the nation that we have to a continually expanding slavery? I think back on a woman in Philadelphia who owned a white poodle, a wonderful white poodle. She loved this dog more than anything else. In the morning when she would get up, the poodle would be there, and the poodle would sit with her as she had her breakfast. And the poodle stayed with her all day and was her constant companion. She talked to it. She told it stories, better stories than the judges told. But one day, the poodle disappeared. Now, I don't remember exactly when that was. It could have been in 1854. The poodle just flat out disappeared, and the woman was beside herself in misery. She pined over this poodle. She cried out day and night, "Where has my poodle gone? Who could have taken my poodle?" Weeks passed. She lost weight. Her face became haggard. And finally, one day, there was a knock at the door. And the butler went to open the door, and there stood two men with a dog. And they said, "We have your poodle, Mom." Oh, how wonderful. She ran to the door to embrace her dog, but suddenly she stopped about 5 feet from the door. Looking more closely, she asked the men, Is that my poodle?" You see, the dog looked rather scruffy and dirty. She could hardly believe it was the dog she had known. And the men said, "Yes, Mom, we found him down the street." She said, "But he looks so filthy." Said, "Yes, Mom, we found two men who had tied him to a pole and were using him to wash windows." And so when I hear the judge speak, I wonder, has he not been tied to some pole by Southern slave interests? Thank you. He complains. He complains that I am pestering him on this issue of popular sovereignty. And that, too, reminds me of yet one last story. This took place in Indiana during the time I was growing up. But it probably also happened here in Kansas during the territorial days, because I can imagine this happening in many different places where the people were very scattered out and wished to have a preacher who would preach the good word to them. But it was hard to find someone. And so in this little settlement in Indiana, the people built a little shelter out in the woods in the hopes that someday a preacher would come along and they would invite him to give a sermon. And finally, one day it happened. The preacher arrived, and they invited him to give a sermon, and they all turned out and sat there expectantly awaiting the good news. I have to stop a moment and tell you how the preacher was dressed. That's very important. He was wearing the garb that many itinerant preachers of the time wore: baggy pants tied by only one button, and a large flowing shirt that hung down to his knees. It served also as a nightgown, you can imagine, also attached by only one button. Well, the preacher said, "My text today is, 'I am the living Christ, come to me,' and launched into his sermon." He was not a bad preacher. He had a great deal of passion and energy, and fire and brimstone began to pour out, but he had not counted on the fact that in this rude area of the woods, the place was also populated by other than humans, and more specifically, blue lizards. And one mistook his leg for the trunk of a tree and began to climb. Well, the preacher was far into his sermon, couldn't bear to stop. And so, being pestered, he shook his leg a little bit, but that only encouraged the lizard to climb higher. By the time he was getting close to the end of his sermon, he felt the lizard at about chest level. And reaching up with one hand, he unbuttoned his shirt and ripped it off and began to pat himself with the other. But this did no good, because the lizard, suddenly finding himself in the sunlight, decided to go into more sheltered, shady areas, and so headed south. coming close to the end of his sermon, the preacher covered himself with the Bible and with the other hand fumbled at the button of his pants, hoping to get his hand in there and dislodge this rather excruciating lizard. But his timing was bad, because at that very moment he came to the end of his sermon, raising the Bible in one hand and outstretching his arm to the congregation with the other. He said, "I am the Christ, come to me." And his pants slid down to his feet. For a moment, the congregation stared at the preacher, and the preacher stared at the congregation. And finally, one elderly woman in the front row got up and headed for the exit and said, "If this is religion, I'm through reading the Bible." Now, I hope you will be thinking also, if this is popular sovereignty, I'm through with it. But let me now get to the real issue that divides us. Judge said it correctly. It's not the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It is the issue of right and wrong. This is the issue that forever divides people. This is the real issue that will continue in this country long after the poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself are silent. It's the same issue, the same principle between right and wrong from the beginning of time throughout the world. It is that issue which on one side speaks for the common humanity of people, and on the other, the divine right of kings. Whatever shape it takes, it is that same issue. When it comes from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride his own people and live off the fruits of their labor, who says to his people, "You work, you toil, you earn the bread, and I'll eat it." Or whether it comes as an excuse by one race of people to enslave another, it is the same principle. It is the same tyrannical principle. And I'm grateful to Judge Douglas tonight for helping us to see that it's not the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's not these issues about equality as such, but it is the issue of right and wrong. And we can take that and apply it to Judge Douglas's comments when he says, "I don't care whether slavery is voted up or down." Well, that's a perfectly logical thing to say if slavery is right. But if slavery is wrong, a man cannot say, "I don't care if something that's wrong is voted up or down." And the judge says that the people of a community have a right to have slaves. And so they do, logically, if slavery is right. But if slavery is wrong, it makes no sense for a people to have a right to do something that is wrong. And so the judge says, slaves are merely property, like any other property, and so can be carried anywhere that other property can be carried. And so once again, that is perfectly logical if slavery is right. But if slavery is wrong, it makes no sense to compare it to blueberries or alcohol or any other form of property. It is simply wrong. Now, whenever we can get the people to see this clearly, whenever we can move all these other issues out of the way, and so people can clearly see this is what it is, the struggle between right and wrong, it's at that point that the people of the nation leave the Democrat Party with its confusion and come to the Republican Party and place themselves on the side of right. And when they do that, there will be no more war, there will be no more violence, There will be no more struggle, because reasonable people will have understood that this is the issue, and they will make the steps that the framers of the Constitution, the founders of this nation, the only people who used a wise and just policy, put in place, and that is to place slavery where the public mind can rest in the assurance that it is on the course of ultimate extinction. Thank you. Thank you, George.
Very much. Thank you, Senator Douglas. Thank you, Mr. Lincoln, for sharing your views with us. I think that those of us here in the Kansas Territory have a very good understanding of where you currently stand. Before we open it to questions from the audience, I do want to clarify just one thing. I have referred to you as Senator Douglas, but I hear Mr. Lincoln refer to you as Judge Douglas. Which is right, and how should I refer to you?
Well, Mr. Lincoln refuses to recognize the will of the people. As a result of our debates, the Illinois legislature re-elected me to my third term in the Senate, but Mr. Lincoln prefers to ignore the fact that I'm a U.S. Senator and talk to me about being Judge Douglas.
Moderator, may I respond? I must apologize to the judge for not referring to him as a senator. It's a story that takes place years ago.
You had to ask.
When the judge was a member of the Illinois state legislature and found himself in disagreement with one of the decisions of the Illinois State Supreme Court. And so he engineered a bill in the legislature to expand the number of judges on the Supreme Court. And when that bill went through, he got his friends in the legislature to appoint him a member of the Supreme Court. And then, while both Stephen Douglas and myself have risen from the common people, he asked us all to refer to him as Judge Douglas. Now, this took some doing because he had never tried a single case in his life. But there he was on the Supreme Court. And so we worked very hard trying to remember to address him as Judge Douglas. And I have spent some 20 years trying to get it into my mind that he is indeed a judge. And it takes some time now to get it out and replace it with senator. So I apologize to the senator.
A very eloquent apology, if I've ever heard one. But thank you, Senator Douglas.
Only been 12 years.
Yes. Do you have questions of either gentleman?
I have a question.
Yes, at the back.
For Senator
Douglas.
Douglas. Sir, I was taken by your statement about the Texas territory of dividing it into 3 different states. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, this is a question about the Texas territory and your thought of dividing that into at least 3 different areas. What was your thinking there, sir?
Well, actually, I would like to say that we admitted the state of Texas, but we suggested that the state of Texas might very well wish to divide itself into 4 additional states for a total of 5. But there was some concern about whether they would all be slave states. But in our debate, we were all pretty certain that if it were to happen, they might not go to a total of 5, 4 new ones. But if they did, it was pretty certain that at most there would be 1 more slave state. And that was our thinking.
Are there other questions over here, perhaps? Yes, back here in the center. Yes, sir, you.
The idea of popular sovereignty. Judge, you are the member of what body of the U.S. government?
The idea of popular sovereignty, and you are a member of which body of government, sir?
Well, I belong to the legislative branch and I serve in the United States Senate.
Now, why was the Senate created with 2 members from every state?
And why was the Senate created with 2 members from every state?
Well, my concept or my understanding of that was so that each state would have a statewide voice and an equal vote among the states.
So this means that popular sovereignty for the national government was not necessarily a good idea because of perhaps a tyranny of the majority that would disadvantage states. So it seems to me that the idea of popular sovereignty has already been addressed by the founders of the country, and they found that it has some shortcomings.
Well, this is an interesting question. It relates to the structure of the United States government, and this gentleman's feeling that popular sovereignty has already been dealt with and proven wrong.
Judge, I want you to know that we Republicans did not plant him in the audience.
Well, he might as well be a Republican because he shows your same inability to selectively remember history. The problem in the Constitutional Convention, sir, was the original concept was to have each state represented in a Congress with 1 vote apiece. And in a compromise developed by the great Benjamin Franklin and working with Roger Sherman of Connecticut, it was determined to have a House of Representatives representing the people by population. And then to have, in addition to that, a council, a Senate, by which each state could have a voice. And further, it was determined that that body would be elected by the state legislatures, once again representing the popular will of the people. I do not think the intent has ever been anything more than trying to give as much representation as possible to the will of the people.
Do you have other questions over here? Yes, here at the back. Yes, go ahead.
This is a question for the senator. Senator, the notion of popular sovereignty has brought ruffians, hooligans, transients, general ill repute to our territory. What say you to the grieving families of the dead innocents who wanted to ply their agriculture and their commerce free from violence of outsiders?
Well, this has to do with the results of popular sovereignty that has led to Bleeding Kansas and the fact that people have been killed and there has been war and tragedy when all that people wanted to do was come into the territory. Perhaps you'd both like to respond to this question and comment.
My only response is, Judge, we didn't plant him either. Go right ahead.
Did you underestimate the impact of popular sovereignty in Kansas?
Well, I would first of all say that nowhere in our history have we had a situation where a territory was open to have an election and we had people coming across rivers or across borders to participate in that election. And the same principle in these elections has held true for 50 years. If you are present on the day of the election, you're entitled to vote as long as you declare an intent to settle in the territory. We had no idea that there would be this kind of, I guess I would say, migration into the territory for the purpose of dominating the ballot. And I might say that when it became clear that there were issues of fraud, I denounced the results of that election. And I denounced the Lecompton Constitution. By the way, it cost me my chairmanship on the territory. I do not support violence. I abhor the acts of the border ruffians. And I applaud the courage of the settlers, and I do applaud the fact that we now have a fair and legitimate election which does reflect truly the will of popular sovereignty.
So you're saying that you totally underestimated and you too have paid the price having to give up your chairmanship.
Well, I think you and Mr. Lincoln enjoy putting words in my mouth. It's not a question. It's not a question of underestimating at all.
I'm just here to repeat the question.
That we had no history that this kind of issue would result with, and among reasonable men, rather than border ruffians, this would not have happened.
Yes,
And
indeed.
we did insist that the law and fair elections be instituted. We did not accept, except perhaps for the misguided president of this country, we did not accept this as a true result. And we did work to protect the interests of the will of the majority.
Well, in your response, you've hit upon another issue that is of importance to many in the territory. When you talk about reasonable men, you know, there are reasonable women here in this territory who are seeking to be represented as well.
And indeed, if under popular sovereignty, we see the expansion of the electorate, that is just and good. But I would point out to you, Madam Moderator, that the history of this country is the expansion of the electorate. We began with property qualifications, we have them no more. We had religious tests, we have them no more. We had literacy tests, we have them no more, and instead we now have public education by which we will train an educated citizenry if the local legislatures do their duty.
If now, in other words,
But it is the popular sovereignty of the people that can determine the actions of the legislature.
in other words, if we wait long enough, we'll, you know, get our turn. Are there questions over here? Way at the back, yes.
I have a question for Mr. Lincoln.
A question for Mr. Lincoln.
Mr. Lincoln, 1857, 60% of the gross national product was in cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Without the slaves, where's the money for the United States going to come from?
This is an interesting question. It relates to the economy of the United States. Without slavery, will we be able to compete in the world economic market, Mr. Lincoln?
It seems to me that the questioner assumes that the only kind of labor that can be used is slave labor. I stand for free labor. I believe that men will have the opportunity to earn their own bread and to eat it themselves without the leave of anybody else. And I look forward to the day when slavery comes to its ultimate extinction. And I see no problem with people who were formerly slaves working and gaining the results of their work.
There is a more practical, a more immediate, and I might say, a better answer, Mr. Lincoln. And that is the settlement of the territories of the West and their admissions as states as quickly as possible. And in doing that, the creation of a network of public education and a network of transcontinental railroads. And I believe that will be a place of free labor. But in doing this, instead of having to lose ourselves in economic progress, we can replace economies, expand economies, and in doing that, be of greater benefit to all of the people rather than making free labor suffer because we have economic depression. But of course, the Republican Party, in its great concern about the equality of the Negro only, is not considering the well-being of the great white majority of this country and the common people who will form the farmers, the entrepreneurs, the mechanics who will make the West the greatest portion of this country.
Let me just say in response to that, that the judge seems to have this vision that all the territories are going to end up being free. Why does he think so? Has he ever explained that to you? There is, in his mind, some sense that God himself has drawn a line and said slavery on this side, freedom on that. And he thinks that God has ordained it. But I ask you, have you seen that line? If God actually drew such a line, don't you think he would make it more palpable than a river here or a mountain range there? Can you trust the judge's vision?
I'm not so prideful to think I know what God wants, Mr. Lincoln, but then, of course, you know your papa.
One question more.
Mr. Lincoln?
Yes, sir.
If slavery is wrong, if you look forward to its abolition in some future date, how do you propose to accomplish that if it is to be tolerated, if its continuation is to be tolerated in the state where it is already established?
Well, this is indeed an interesting question, and thank you for asking that. This has to do with the position that the recently reformed Republican Party has taken to oppose the extension of slavery, but to allow it to exist in its present boundaries. So how do you address that issue, Mr. Lincoln? Isn't that a bit hypocritical, short-sighted?
Yes, thank you. And it sounds like a question that would come from some settlers here from Missouri or other slave states, and I would like to respond to that. I must confess that I have no magical way of ending slavery. I recognize, as many Southerners say, they are no more responsible for slavery than we in the North are, and I think that there's truth in that. Nor would I know how to end it, and they say they don't know how to end it either. And if we were to end slavery immediately, by one stroke of the pen or the sword, what then would happen to those formerly enslaved creatures? Would they suddenly be able to enjoy the fruits of their freedom? Or would they find themselves in an extremely difficult situation? I have supported the views of Henry Clay and the American Colonization Society that hopes to find a way to allow free blacks to return to Africa and take with them some of the blessings of American ideas and American spirit. But could this be done immediately? No. If all of the blacks in America were suddenly transported to Africa, they would die within 10 days. And so I can only say that with reasonable people struggling to solve this and some form of gradual emancipation, there will indeed come a time when slavery in this nation will come to an end.
Sir, you have a lively and engaged audience, but I know, like all good politicians, you have another speech to give somewhere, and we don't want to impose on your time. So please let me say thank you, Senator Douglas, for your presentation this evening. Thank you, Mr. Lincoln, for your presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you the scholars who stand behind this magnificent characterizations. Mr. Fred Mr. Fred Krebs of Johnson County Community College. And Mr. Dick Johnson of California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, California. Fred is a professor of history at Johnson County Community College, and I want to say that his presentation this evening is made possible in part by a grant from Johnson County Community College to the Kansas Humanities Council in recognition of his service to that institution. And if you had trouble getting a seat here tonight, it's because friends of Fred have showed up. And I think they're taking most of these sections over here or somewhere. He's very active in his community. In addition to his teaching, he's recently served a term as district governor of Rotary International. And we're pleased to have Fred with us. Thank you very much, Fred. Dick is a professor of 19th century American history at California State Polytechnic University. I want to say that one more time because it's hard to remember and get out all the same. He has many scholarship and journals to his credit. And both of these men are veterans of the Chautauqua Circuit. Fred has done Benjamin Franklin, our very own William Allen White, and Dick has done, among his characterizations, John Dos Passos and Alexis de Tocqueville and others. And you can see that their skill is really honed, and it's beautiful to watch them work here together. I know you have questions of them, and I'd like to just begin by asking them to tell you how they put these presentations together, because I've been on the circuit with them 4 weeks now, and I heard this was fresh. Some of this I'd never heard before, particularly that joke. I mean, some of those jokes, you know, it's like stories. So tell us how you put the parts of the debates together.
Well, the first mistake I made is I gave Dick a book of Abe Lincoln stories. I've got to say that when we met back in August, and Dick and I had had some conversations before that, but I've had an idea for some time that rather than have two people on the stage, each doing a 25 or 30-minute presentation, and then having the audience address questions to the person of their choice, I've always wanted something a little bit more interactive. It seemed like the Lincoln-Douglas debate was a natural, and Dick and I sat down and scripted out some material from the debates, and we actually have excerpts between the two of us from each of the 7 debates. And of course, the other thing is that I've got to say that Senator Douglas, I think, unfortunately, is definitely the second banana here. And so I really feel like I've been quite fortunate of working with a man who really does bring the ideas of Lincoln back to life in Dick Johnson. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. And it's also an honor and a privilege to portray Abraham Lincoln. And I just want to say, I think Fred said it very well. It reminds me of a story.
Oh, really?
In the first debate, Douglas actually praised Lincoln, sometimes with faint praise, and Lincoln stood up and said, you know, I feel just like the Hoosier who liked honey cake and said, I don't think there's any man who likes it more than me and gets less of it. But that's another story. I wanted to say that in sort of to Nathan, I hope he didn't feel bad about giving the answer of 5 legs to the dog. It turns out that we've tried this in, I think, 3 of our 4 communities, and every time the answer has come out 5. And I've had to struggle with this and try to figure out, what do I do now? But the reality is that when I first read this story, and all of the stories you heard tonight were authentic Lincoln stories, when I first read this story with my
Fred.
PhD and everything, my answer too was 5 legs.
Do you have questions of the scholars here in the front row?
How would the Lincoln-Douglas debates have played on television?
Oh, how would, you mean before C-SPAN, huh? How would the Lincoln-Douglas debates played on television? Were they something that people would sit still for now?
They would have played heavily edited, I think. The debates actually were designed to be about 3 hours long, and as I think some people know, about 10 years ago, C-SPAN, over a period of the actual dates in 1858, did, starting in, August 21st, in each of the 7 towns, did the reenactments. And they did like 3 hours of pre-debate talk and then 3 hours of the debates, where the debates were basically read, I guess, primarily by actors. But that was very interesting. And, but I've got to say that in today, you would have a television editor working very hard at close-ups and sound bites and drawing out of the debate to say, well, at this point, Mr. Lincoln is going to talk about this. Let's go back to get his main quote. And probably with some good sense, they would have tried to edit out some of the stories that they didn't think were registering enough with the audience.
You know, I've been waiting, Fred, to, I found this quote by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which described Senator Douglas's debating style. She said, well, she probably didn't like Douglas anyway, but said his debating style was like a bomb, one that sends out red-hot nails in every direction. You think that's fair?
Well, Douglas was a great orator, but he was a very aggressive speaker. It's interesting that one of the people that observed the debate said that Douglas was the better speaker, the greater orator, that he spoke with great logic and great reason, but absolutely never addressed the heart. And that, I think, was Douglas's great problem. He had the greatest vision of anyone in America about the future of America. He was ahead of most people's thinking, except Abraham Lincoln understood the moral implications of democracy and the role of equality. And Abraham Lincoln, as this same observer said, never failed, in spite of having a weaker voice and a more fumbling style and telling too many stories, the observer said that, managed to always inspire and touch the heart. And in so doing so led to the moral growth of this country.
Yes, over here. Yes, sir.
Would the actual Lincoln-Douglas debates have been as respectful of each other? I mean, it's like you're up there, Clinton and Dole or something.
Well,
Why don't you take that?
yeah.
Been as respectful as you portrayed?
This is a question about the style of debate that we saw here versus the style of debate in the actual Lincoln-Douglas debates. How respectful would they have been to each other at that time?
That raises a very interesting question about the authenticity of what Fred and I have tried to present. When we got together last August for a kind of rehearsal, try this out the first time, we stayed very close to the terms of the debate, and it was very clear to us as we engaged that both men respected each other, and both men saw each other as kind of intellectual challenges and really sort of enjoyed the opportunity. And very soon the members of the Humanities Council said to me, can't you put in some more Lincoln stories? Well, going back over the Lincoln-Douglas debates, we didn't see any stories as such. It's possible that they were there, but were excerpted out. And I think what we clearly understand is that it was Lincoln and his companions who produced the final editing of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And they removed all indications, if there ever were, that Lincoln showed any kind of disrespect or trivializing of Douglas's reputation. So, in fact, to hear you say that we showed a lot of respect to each other, the real Lincoln and Douglas, I think, at least from Lincoln's point, would have shown more respect.
Well, it's really clear that the Kansas Territory, Bleeding Kansas, was a major crisis in American life and American history to that point, national history. And of course, we've had crises before that and crises after that. But as you two have thought about Bleeding Kansas in the territorial period, is there any legacy that a crisis leaves to our country? Is there anything that we can learn from these kinds of crises?
Okay, I'll do a little bit. Yeah, again, doing this kind of thing has been a wonderful experience for Fred and me. It's the real reason that I like to do Chautauqua, because it's a chance to get very intensively involved in a single person, in this case, a particular issue. And I've come to realize much more clearly than I did before that the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the dividing line in American history. That's the point where America starts to move in a very different direction. I would just like to say, I haven't said this before, something fresh, that in 1831, when Alexis de Tocqueville went around the country, and he asked people, about 100 different people, he asked them, what's going to happen in America when slavery ends? The unanimous answer given to him by white people was, there will be a race war. because whites and blacks will not live together side by side. North and South, they both said this. It's quite intriguing that it was so unanimous. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act came the Civil War, and with the Civil War came the Emancipation Proclamation, and America became a very, very, very different society, moved in the direction of what we have today. So I'm very grateful to the Kansas Humanities Council for giving myself and Fred a chance to do this. Fred?
Before we take the final question or comment,
Wait,
I'm
wait.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Well,
It's not another story, is it?
yeah, I don't know, but I wanted to say that since I'm not going to be here on Monday at the breakfast, I want to talk about this crisis concept. It's one that we've been talking about a lot over the last 4 weeks. But before I do that, I want to make one statement very clearly. One of the things that Dick and I have both struggled with in doing Lincoln and Douglas is the racism. The racism is very far from the way both of us think and feel. And part of that, though, is because we thought it was important to portray how these men were thinking, because there is a great evolution of thought going on here. And I frankly think you don't get these kinds of evolutions of thought without crisis. Crisis challenges our beliefs in what reality is. You know, in anthropology, cultural anthropology, we have a definition of culture that is the assumption and perceptions that a people make about reality. And what's happening with the Kansas-Nebraska bill and the act is that Stephen Douglas is stretching the concept of reality as far as he can see it. And it's not enough. The crisis over slavery makes it possible for Abraham Lincoln to expand the paradigm, to see the anomalies, the inconsistencies within the paradigm, and out of that we get an ethics of equality. An ethics of equality, which Gary Wills talks about in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lincoln at Gettysburg. And this ethics of equality changes our whole nature of what's real, of what's important. And it continues to this day. But it takes a crisis to shake the paradigm. And in shaking the paradigm, we create new possibilities of what's real, and as a people, we grow morally, ethically, intellectually. And so this crisis, as you say, is the watershed, and the result, I think, is making the people better by making them more inclusive, less separate. And remember, the two great dangers that Lincoln saw to democracy were towering personal ambition and self-interest to the exclusion of the public good. And I think that in seeing these two men, we have a real attempt to work this out.
Well, if you think these guys are good, then we invite you to come back Tuesday from 5:30 to 7, when the youth Chautauqua will take the main stage. These are middle schoolers here in the community who are right now in the process of identifying historical characters, writing the script, doing the research, finding the costume, and from 5:30 to 7 on Tuesday, they will be here to present their characterizations, and they're pretty good competition for some of these guys up here on the stage right now. Don't miss the Youth Chautauqua. As we've said on other occasions, we'll come back to you, sir. As we've said on other occasions, Chautauqua doesn't just occur here under the tent. We invite you to participate in other parts of the Chautauqua, the breakfasts, the workshops, the historic tours. This is where a lot of the dialogue continues and a lot of the additional deeper thought than we can go into this evening. Tomorrow here in South Park, there will be a craft demonstration, so you can see what kinds of things were occurring here in the territory. There'll be authentic craft demonstrations. The Kansas Center for the Book will be back, and they have a wonderful exhibit on territorial writings and themes, which you'll want to see. The guided tours continue at 9:30 in the morning at the Plymouth Congregational Church. Pastor Cordley Remembers, which will be an actual sermon that was given on the 50th anniversary of Quantrell's raid. Back here at 7 for entertainment, 7:30 for the program. Remember to bring your chairs, would be a good idea. We're going to have Clarena Nichols. And also, if you don't mind, if you want to just help us recycle those fans so that we will have them tomorrow evening for showing whether we agree with the speaker or not. And then on Tuesday, you can take them home with you as a souvenir if you would like. All right, the cleanup batter back here at the back. Yes.
The one question I've always wondered about both Lincoln and Douglas is that neither one of them seemed to anticipate the Civil War. Lincoln actually thought if he allowed slavery where it existed, that would be enough and there would be peace. Why did both such excellent politicians miss the coming Civil War and the reaction to the Lincoln's election?
An excellent final question. Did both of Lincoln and Douglas fail to anticipate the Civil War?
Lincoln, I think from the point of the House Divided speech, made it clear that if there were to come a war, this would be the time for it to happen. But he strongly believed that reasonable people would come to recognize that there was no future for slavery in America, and he thought that those border ruffians, those fire eaters of the South, were really in the minority. When he was here in Kansas Territory in 1859, he addressed a group in Leavenworth, many of whom were pro-slavery. And he said to them that John Brown has been hanged. We agreed with John Brown on the issue of slavery, but that was no excuse for treason, violence, and bloodshed. And just as the law has been enforced against John Brown, you in the southern states should demand that the law be enforced if any effort is made by the states to secede from the Union. So he still thought that there was a firm middle ground of people who would hold the nation together in this formula of allowing slavery to stay in the southern states, that it would last long enough that the nation could remain. His goal of preserving the Union is phenomenal.
I think that Douglas became more and more convinced that preserving the Union was the important issue. I think he became less confident that it could be preserved when the Democrat Party split 3 ways in Charleston in 1860. And while he did receive the nomination of the Northern Wing in Baltimore later in that year, he began to be very concerned about the preservation of the Union. He held Lincoln's hat at the inauguration, and in addition to that, spent 2 months going around the border states urging them to remain in the Union, which they did. But that effort wore him out, and he contracted typhoid fever and died on June 3rd, 1861. I sometimes think that had Douglas lived, he would have been a kind of a loyal opposition, but also seeking perhaps ways of reconciling with the South that might have helped end the war, and perhaps he might have been the Democrat who could have beaten Lincoln in 1864. But Douglas is out of the picture as of June 3rd, 1861, and he died working to preserve the Union.
Thank you very much, Fred and Dick, for this wonderful evening.
Thank you.
You've been a great audience, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Come early for the entertainment and bring your own chair. See you tomorrow night.
Okay.